All right, so I think that we're live. Welcome back to our continuing the series, Cultivating Connections in the Time of COVID, and welcome to Grange Month again, day 2. I'm Amanda Brozana-Rios. I'm the Communications Director for National Grange. I've been reminded multiple times that I need to introduce myself, and so I've done that. But more importantly, I'd like to introduce you to today's guest, which is Phil Prelli, who has the distinction of not only being our National Grange Vice President, but also a former legislator in the state of Connecticut, and even more importantly, maybe the former Commissioner of Agriculture there. So hi, Phil.
Hi, Amanda. How are you today?
Great. How are you?
I'm doing fine. I'd like to be out doing something else, but we're all pretty much stuck in our houses.
We are. And so this has been a really fun way to bring our faces, or at least your faces, they get to see me too much, to our members. So thank you for joining us.
I'm looking forward to our discussion.
So we have posted that earlier this week, actually 2 days ago, we announced that we have a partnership where we've put out some information about the census, and we're encouraging everyone to be involved. And that's what our discussion is kind of revolving around today. I think that this is important not just for Grange members, but for Grange members to share with other people in rural communities and everywhere generally that, you know, being counted and having an accurate count is really an important thing for our nation. And so I wanted to just turn it over to you to start that discussion off. And I obviously want to encourage anybody who's joining us live to give us questions or comments. We'll be presenting those to Phil, and hopefully we'll be answering why exactly it is that you should fill out those forms, especially now if you're home and have nothing to do for 5 minutes, because that's about all it takes. So go ahead, Phil.
Hey, Amanda, I totally agree with you. It's so important that we all get in there and fill out our census. I was lucky enough to do ours this year, and we had one of the shorter ones. We didn't have one of the community ones, but they said it would take 10 minutes, and I'm not exactly a fast typer, and it was less than 10 minutes for me. So it doesn't take a lot of time, but I think it is important that everybody thinks about it. And I say that because so often it gets put off. You think, well, I have time to do this later on. And yesterday was National Census Day. And I was seeing in our paper today, that our local paper, that they were happy because they thought about 40% of Connecticut had responded. And that was a good number. I'm a little worried about 40%. And I'm worried because as you think about it, those people who were going to do it right away did it. And so that's the 40% we get. And those that put it off, will continue to put it off, and they're going to have to be contacted again. The other concern I have is obviously with the virus, and it's going to have an effect, I think, 2 ways on how people respond to the census. Number one is you're not going to have people around knocking on doors trying to do a head count. The census is really going to be either mail in or it's going to be done on the computer. And most of it is done, by the internet on the computer right now. So I have a concern that because the virus is there, people aren't going to be going around and getting reminded. The other thing is the people who live in the more rural areas of the country, in Connecticut, we're pretty lucky. There's not a lot of places that don't have very good internet connection. But in some rural areas, there are. And they're not going to be able to get out and get to the hot spots, to their local libraries, to sit down and do this. So how are we going to get that done and make sure that all that gets done? That's a concern I have. And I think it's very important, because if everyone doesn't get counted, then your state's going to be left, then your state's going to be hurt, because you're not going to get the funding that you should be getting from the federal government. So I think those are my concerns leading in. And, as we're doing social distancing, I think we're not out talking about it, and we're not out looking about it and saying this is the way to go. So we can talk a little bit about why it's important to do the census and why it's important to get that count. The first one is, everybody thinks of the census. What do? They think, oh, they're just counting me, and they're doing it so they know so we can divide up our Congress people. It's so much more than that. That's the first step to it. If you're not counted, and we don't count everybody in there, is your state going to have their fair share of Congress people? That's the number one thing, and I think that's what most people think of the census as doing. Most people think, oh, they count it, but they go so much deeper, and there's so much more information that's available through the census. You know, you don't think about it, but when you're filling that out, you're showing them your age. You're showing them how many members are in your household. You're showing them your race and ethnicity. You're showing them your family makeup. All those go into a further breakdown on how those census numbers are used and how we look to the future. When we go into even the apportionment of the congressional people, there's got to be some racial minority districts in every state. That number comes out of where the census are. So when they redraw those congressional districts, there's enough gerrymandering without it, but even with it, they look at it and they still have to set up special districts. So I think, you know, as we think about that, and that's all that's in there in the census. So that's the number one reason why we have to do the census, is to make sure that we are counted and we have all the people for our congressional districts. So many states are losing because of the way populations are shifting. States are losing and states are gaining congressional districts, and they will after this 2020 census. They won't do it for the next coming up election in 2020. It won't be until 2022, but we will see that happening down the road. So that's the number one thing. And then as a follow-up to that, we get into the whole idea of our states districting and how our states set up our our legislative districts, because they're all set on a one person, one vote basis. So those numbers go down and we use them in the congressional districts to redo setting up our legislative districts and our state senate districts, or unless you're in the state of Nebraska, you only get one house, but the rest of us all have two houses to set up by a population basis. And again, by minority, they have to have minority districts. So that gets a further breakdown of what those census numbers are used for. So not only do they set up our federal offices, they also set up our state offices. So those are the first two major issues that we look at and say, but for the bigger cities, we also look at how they set up their wards and how their towns are set up for their local districts. That all comes out of that census information. So usually, you know, by this point, we're a little farther ahead in the whole point, but that's where we are with the districts. Now, why else is it important? Every state gets money from the federal government. We get money for what? We get money for housing, we get Medicaid funding, we get road funding, we get you know, help with our hospitals. All those come in, and all that comes off. All that is worked out using our census numbers. So if you're not counted in that, your state's not going to get those money. In 2015, there was over $670 billion. That's $670 billion given to the states that were based on the census equation. So think about that. If you don't get in there and get your numbers in, that's what's going to happen. So I think that's one of the reasons we look at it. From an agricultural standpoint, we also look at it for funding for certain farmers. Federal Agricultural Statistics uses that numbers to help with how they do money there. We also get rural development money from the Department of Agriculture. And what most people don't think about from an agricultural standpoint is that's where our food stamp money also comes from. What we always called our food stamp. Those funds that go in to help with our school lunch programs and also the food repair, that comes through the numbers off our census. So those are all there in agriculture. So that's the third step in how the census is used. I don't know if we have any questions up to those three things. There's a couple others to follow up with, but those are the three major areas that we would look at to begin with.
Yeah, so one of the questions I guess I had was why are demographics important other than just those minority districts? Why is it important that we know the age or gender, or race, not just the number.
The demographics also come into one of the next steps down, which is future planning. When we're looking at how we're going to use money from the federal government in the future from certain projects. Let's say that you want to build a new school and you're going to look to the federal government or your state government and say, I need funding for a new school. They look at the census and see that your young population is, your young married families are going down, you're an aging population. Why do we need a new school? Why are we adding on to that school now, rather than an area in the state where the population might be younger, you had more students? You would use that, you would then move the money there. Or if you're looking from the federal government, like from rural development, let's say you want to put in a new sewage treatment plant. And they look at it and you find your population's going down. You don't need that larger sewage treatment plant. Or you have an aging population that it's going to be going down in the future. Your population's been decreasing. Maybe that sewage treatment plant, that money is going to be better used in a state where the population is increasing, where that we have a trend towards increasing, or that we have a younger population that we know is going to continue to grow. So that's why they use that information. They also use it on figuring out, am I going to need additional funding to help for, let's say, Medicaid, because we might have families in there that are going to need assistance. That answer, what you're looking for.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think you can extrapolate a lot of information from data. For example, if you know that families of certain racial background tend to have a larger or smaller number of people living in a household, you can make assumptions that when populations shift, there's going to be larger or smaller impact to your communities.
But you also would look at that and say, oh, I have a large population of young marrieds that are renting right now. In 5 years, when they might be looking at owning their own house and building housing and growing that population there for housing, therefore I'm going to see an increase in, let's say, school-age children, that type of move. So all that comes out of those numbers on the type of household you're living in. Are you renting? Do you own a house? Are you looking at a house in an area that they know that a house has small bedrooms? There's only 2 bedrooms, yet all of a sudden you have 2 kids already and you're still a young family. Are you going to need a larger house? All those demographics are looked at and all those demographics are weighed.
So just from those basic demographics, I assume it's not just the federal government that draws conclusions, but there's other professions that use that information. And I know prior to your term in the legislature and, as Commissioner of Agriculture, you were a licensed insurance agent. Is that correct?
Correct.
So did you use it in your professional life, and what other professions do you know of that use it?
I don't think so much in the insurance industry we did. I think in the construction industry, it's used an awful lot. I think in new home development, it's used an awful lot. I think as we're in the real estate industry, they're the ones who look at how the population is flowing. Is the population leaving your state? Is it coming in? How am I going to sell that way? I won't say the insurance industry, we didn't look at it and say, hey, our population's going down. How are we going to address that, or what are we going to look at? It just wasn't as major of an issue. I think one of the keys that we're going to be looking at, and especially after the virus hit, what are we going to do about hospitals in the future? And how are we going to do that? And how are we going to make that work? As you know, the Grange is very active in looking at broadband for rural America. And we're looking at that, saying that telemedication is going to be very important, and those hospitals are going to be very important. Now, those hospitals are going to be built differently. But we're also seeing that maybe we need a better way of having an emergency facility fairly available down the road, and how's the money going to be used in that? All that comes out of the demographics. Are you going to build another large hospital in an area of the country where the population is decreasing? Or are you going to build that where the area is increasing? So as we look at all those types of numbers and we figure out how we're going to serve that population in the future, and I think telemedicine is going to be one of the biggest things moving forward. You're not going to have to go see your doctor or go to the emergency room right away. You're going to be able to get some answers. Similar to you and I are talking right now. We're going to be over the internet and talking. But that doesn't mean we're still not going to need those facilities. So we've got to weigh that, and how are we going to build that, and how are we going to make sure they're going to meet all the needs in the future. And we're learning an awful lot about how we need to be able to be more flexible in the type of facility we have right now.
Absolutely. You mentioned, a big thing that I've been working this week on getting our magazine out, and working on an article about, rural health and rural hospitals. And it's amazing when you look at those population statistics and you look at information about where the hospitals and facilities and providers are. And of course, they're drawing the population statistic information from the census. That is the most accurate and complete, theoretically, grouping of data for that. Susie Ram from Oregon mentioned that she had a concern about if you filled out the census before April 1, which was theoretically the start date, and someone passed away, or you could also have somebody move or be born, that corrections could be filed, and she hadn't realized that they could be. So can you talk a little bit about who you're supposed to count and what you do if you count wrong?
You're supposed to count everybody who normally lives in your household. We all think about it as a family, but it's if that individual normally spends a majority of their life in your household, they should be counted. The big question comes about the college student. Where are they going to be counted, and where do they count their lives? I think, and most of us, when I had college age students, we counted them as part of our household. Again, it's people who are dependent on you. I sort of look at it probably if they're on your IRS form as a dependent, they definitely need to be counted in your household.
You know that the college here, because we're in Shippensburg, which Shippensburg University is a small but member university of the state system here, there was a big push for them to, of course, this is prior to COVID and everybody going home, but to make sure that students were counted here, because it matters for roads, it matters for schools, it matters for other things, which roads they use, the schools they may not, because they may not have children in them, but they certainly are using other facilities like the wastewater and stuff like that. And it seemed odd to me, because I did think about, my dad probably would have counted me when I was in college, even though I wasn't using the facilities there, but my college would have provided an accurate count of in-resident students, I would think, to someone. So I was wondering about that issue.
One of the questions on the form is, do you live in another area at any time during the year? Do you have a vacation home? Are you away at school? So the answer to what I think the better way of answering that is to say, yes, you have a student away at school and they're away at school. So that there's a float in between the two. That students are away, or you have a second home. Yes, there's a need for certain facilities because there are people who have a second home in a vacation area. So I think the question is there, but yeah, you can make the change. And, we're looking at this right now saying we're filling out a form, and they're telling us that 100,000 people to 200,000 people are probably going to pass away in the next month. That's a pretty scary number, but how are we going to adjust those numbers? I don't think they're statistically that major, because they're not all going to hit in one area. But as we're talking about this, we're also saying that, we talked a little bit about planning, which is the fifth part of why we need the census, is so we can plan things for the future. But the fourth one, but the fifth one is the emergency response. How many people are there when we have an emergency like this? So we get to know, maybe not so much because of the coronavirus, because that's an illness, but when we have tornadoes hit an area, how many people lived in that area? Or we have major flooding or another a hurricane hits? How many people lived in that area? How's FEMA gonna respond to that? What do they have to bring in for the type of materials? That's all driven off your census. So I think those are all issues that, we need to make sure that we're informing them and moving forward. Again, can we edit it? Can you change it? I'm sure that going on the census you can. But I think they want to count I think they're looking for count as of April 1st.
Yeah, I noticed that Jen Noss just joined us, and I see several other folks. Jen, I'm calling out because I know she's an educator. And when I was on the census website recently, I noticed that they have resources for educators to use census stuff to talk about different curriculum things, whether it be, math percentages and things like that, all the way down to, how it can be used in certain things. I thought that was really interesting. So it seems like, to me, it's not just us sitting here talking about what the census is and how it can be used and why it's important, but it seems like the Census Bureau and a lot of other organizations are doing a lot to draw attention to the importance of
it. And I think so many groups look at those demographics and drill down into those demographics for an area and what they're teaching and how they're going to teach and how what they should be planning. I think until you get involved and until you're actually involved in a program that starts drilling down into what's there in the census and the reports that they have, you really don't understand the knowledge that they have. I think so many people think, oh, the census, it's going to count how many people live in my town, but it's doing so much more, and it's helping so many people figure out and planning ahead. I think the planning part of it is a part that most people don't think about. That so many governments just look at that and say, how can I now use the numbers to figure out where I'm going? Do I need a new highway that's going to lead 20 miles into out into the county because all of a sudden I've got a population that's going to be growing there in the near future? So how many times have we been stuck, or have we been found that we have to try to build a highway after the houses are there, and how expensive that is, that it's easier to build it beforehand? Or how are we going to do a better job with mass transit in certain areas because the population's growing? I think those numbers are what transportation people look at.
So, that's a really good point, is that it's harder to reverse engineer something than engineer something correctly from the get-go, and the census allows us to do a better job with that. I noticed that a lot of folks who are joining us and who have answered the question of if they filled out the census or not are saying that they filled it out online and that it was fairly easy to complete. One question that came in was, what about the security and privacy? It seems like there's a lot of folks who have a concern about privacy and whether or not that data is secure and what it could possibly be used for, as well as scams and things related to the census.
The security on the census is very high. And when they look at it, you're not allowed to look at individuals in a household. Like, they can't come to my house and look at my individual information. They look at composite information. Like, you'll see everything I've ever seen on the census, and I'm not saying that somebody can't get in and look at it, but everything I've ever seen is that they'll say, in this town, 30% of the people are between the ages of 30 and 45, 15% are over 65. If you live in the Northeast, it might be the opposite, but so they look more at reports that show that information. They'll look at reports that show the makeup, ethnicity makeup. I think one of the big questions is on the ethnicity makeup. It's like it asks you what your ethnicity is, and it puts down Italian. And for white families or non-Hispanic, I think it puts down Italian, Irish. Most people now are multi-generational American families. We don't, in the category. So I filled it out as an American. I didn't know what to put because I'm like a third generation family here on one side and a 8th generation family on the other. So I think, it's hard to put in there. I think that question needs to be looked at a little bit more in the future. I think it was more true in the 20th century than it is in the 21st century.
I think I agree with you a lot on that because, I mean, we're just a slightly different generation, but I struggle with that because I don't know a lot of my family history on certain, back past a certain point. And I think a lot of people, myself and younger, don't maybe know that history. But more than that, my husband and I were sitting and doing it, and he is Mexican American. So we know where he's from. We know he's Peruvian on one side, Mexican on another. But the other thing that was really interesting was looking and saying, well, he's Hispanic, but then is he also white? And he doesn't identify, like if you're talking about what you identify as versus what the census wants you to put, if he were filling it out himself, he would not have put that. He just would not have answered that way. And so it's really interesting, those questions, because sometimes you do struggle with figuring out where you're supposed to be on there.
Right. But I think it's important that you take a minute and think about it and answer that question, because it filters down later on how your community is looked at.
I noticed that Susie Ram had also mentioned that she's a genealogist, and she was disappointed to find that they weren't asking more information because that's stuff that she would normally be looking for when she's going back into, records for families. And so you mentioned the community survey or a longer census version. Can you tell a little bit about what the difference of those are?
I'm not really big. I don't remember. I think we have filled out that one time, and it really gets down into, there's a lot more, there's a number of questions, but I haven't looked at it, and I've got to be honest with you, I just haven't paid that much attention to all the questions there. So I'm not an expert on that. Hopefully somebody maybe in there has filled one out and they can tell you how long it sort of took that. But I know it gets down to more of what your parents' ethnicity, that as I remember it, and how long have you lived in a town and that type of thing. So I think all that comes into play.
Things like that, I believe, are all on there, those type of details. And I know that that's not something you can sign up for and say, I'd love to give you all of my information, learn all about me. They do pick that at random, so it is representative.
Yeah, it's a random representative sample rather than everybody filling them out. But maybe a lot of your people, I can remember when we got the knock on the door and there was actually a census counter who would come and ask us all these questions and break that down. That was a few years ago. But that's what's changed, and we can do it now online. And first of all, it's less chance of error because you're putting the information in rather than somebody copying the information in. It's quicker and like I said, more accurate.
And I think about the privacy question when you mentioned the door knocking. I would much rather put my stuff in online through what I assume to be and have no reason to believe is not a perfectly secure government system than have someone come knocking at my door, because I'm of a generation that I just don't want to answer my door to strangers. And especially if I'm at home alone as a woman, like I'm probably going to answer that door with something on my hip that they may not want to see. And so I think to myself, I have that opposite reaction to privacy. Don't knock on my door. That's my space. So I wonder, if you've seen anyone who seems to want the door knocking that's of a different generation than myself.
I think, well, right now, I don't think anybody wants anybody coming and knocking on their door. But I think in general, some people were used to it. I don't know how else they're going to do if they don't get an answer from a household. Because they'll be tracking this, who's responded and who hasn't, and they'll follow up with mail, and they'll follow up with types trying to get a hold of people. Now, whether that's a mail and saying somebody's going to be coming to your door to knock out, hopefully they'll be informing people ahead of time. But I think you're right. I think even the generation that's used to that now isn't expecting that. I don't think in our society we're expecting people to come knocking on our door unless they happen to be a Girl Scout selling Girl Scout cookies, and I'm not even sure that happens anymore. But how much that happens instead of right outside the supermarket. But
I encouraged my dad, who called me and said, I got this thing in the mail and I have to go online to do it by phone, because there's a phone number on there that you can call. You can put in your code and you're into the exact same queue. You're just working with an automated system. And so, it was easier to have him do that than try and give him, the whole give me the code and I'll go do this for you. But there's definitely multiple ways that the census is trying to get to people to do this. But you're right, rural broadband is a huge issue here.
so I think, I'm concerned because usually the rural areas are the areas that do a better job of responding. Usually they're a higher percentage response. The cities tend to be a lower response to the census, whether that has to do with worried about, because remember, it's counting everybody, whether they're citizens or not. It's not a citizen count. So whether they're concerned on, is this going to be used against me and my citizenship, I can't relate to that. I mean, I have to be honest, I can't relate to how they're going to react to that. But I think you're seeing that less and less in the cities. You're seeing less response in the cities. So I think that's where a big push I know in the state of Connecticut is right now, trying to get the information out. PSA similar to what the Grange did. Other groups getting PSAs out saying, you've got to count. You've got to be there to get your count, because those are areas that we have to make sure that we understand what those population bases are.
So I hope everybody has seen our PSA. We've had it out here on Facebook. We have a link, and we also have a post that includes the 30-second PSA. And some of you in markets where Comcast is available and you have Comcast service may be seeing that on their network, because they have partnered with the census to provide different groups who have influence with certain populations to encourage people to take part in the census. And we were contacted as a influencer in rural communities, which is great to hear that someone at the census and someone at Comcast believes that we are important enough to influence rural communities to take this seriously.
And I think as more and more groups are out there saying to their contingent constituents, get out there and do this, we should get a better response. Are we going to get 100% response? We all know the answer to that is no. But I hope that we get a very high percentage so that we know that those numbers are accurate, so that those numbers can be used properly. We know that the population is shifting. We know there's going to be a change in the makeup of Congress in 2020 for the 2022 elections. We know that there's going to be a makeup difference in our local legislatures. So if you're not in there getting counted, is your area going to be properly represented? It's your responsibility to get your area properly represented. If you want to worry about how we're going to look at building some new roads or fixing a road, if the government right now is talking about another $2 trillion package that's going to be built based on infrastructure, I hope we're looking at a census count that we're making, that what we're doing with that infrastructure makes sense. That we're not just doing little projects because somebody in Congress thinks it's a good idea. That we have a backup and saying, no, these are why we need these. If you need to go to rural development and you say, I need a new water treatment plant, or I need a new water supply plant, hopefully you have the arguments there to say, this is why I need it. And you'll be able to get that funding through the Department of Agriculture for those type of treatments. And I think it's really important in rural areas. One of the other things that comes out of it is it gives each state the definition of what rural is in their area. I don't know if I've told you this story. When I was in the legislature, I was on National Conference of State Legislatures Agriculture Committee. And I was talking to I was a vice chairman. I was talking to another vice chairman, and we were talking about, and I said, well, I represent one of the more rural areas of the state of Connecticut. He said, what's your smallest town? I said, a little less than 1,000 people. I said, what's your smallest town? He said, 3. So the whole definition of what rural is varies state to state. And we need to look at that and say, what's the rural part of your state? And, you're from Pennsylvania, so you don't have the real small towns either. But, when you get out in the Midwest and West, you do.
I know that, just a fun aside, we have a very small town in the county that I grew up in. It's 87 people. It is adjacent, directly abutting our only city in the county, which is a city of about 20,000 people or so. And for over a year, they had no government in their town because no one would step up. And so census figures actually were important there because they could qualify for certain programs because of how small they were. But there was no one there to work that system for them.
Well, hopefully the state government was helping them get some of the funding they needed to work that system, even though they didn't have that government. Yeah, it's always a problem getting some people in small areas to represent their towns.
Yeah, they were famously known for in 2000 electing an 18-year-old mayor who ended up on Jay Leno one evening. So it tells you just how interesting that town's been for how long. Okay, so one of the other things I think that I wanted you to talk a little bit more about that you touched on earlier was just how agriculture is impacted by the census. And I'll start with one specific question and then let you go on the agriculture part. And that is, if you were a farmer who has an H-2A program, sometimes those require the facilities for the workers to be on site. So if you are bringing migrant labor in, you are housing them. Are those farmers typically counting those individuals because they're there for 6 to 9 months, or do you know how that works?
It depends on how long they're there for. And I think they have to look at those numbers and count for how long they're there for. I think the form said, are you there more than 6 months for the standard? So I think as they're looking at that, they would have to answer that. I think it would be difficult for them to say they're members of their household. So I think that there's probably, I'd have to look at that, but they probably have to report that in a different way to the census on a farming basis. I've never really looked at that closely. We might have some people there who have been involved in that and would have that answer better than I do. But I think, but you do point out a very good point that as we look at agriculture in those communities, we have to understand that just like in vacation towns, there are times when their peak is higher, their population peak is higher than it is when there's, in a vacation area when they're not there. We have vacation areas that triple in size during the summer, let's say. And so we need to be able to count both of those and say, this is where it is. I know that when they asked us if we had another home, which we do, they asked where that address was also. So I think it's important to know that. And I think that's what you'd see more with the H-2A numbers.
I think Joan Smith pointed out that USDA does an agricultural census, and so they may integrate some data across those different forms and things like that. So how else is agriculture impacted, and why should we, who are not on farms, we consumers, care that the census is being done right and well for those communities where agriculture is vital?
I think we have to be careful what we're talking about agriculture. And sometimes we forget what the Department of Agriculture has to account. And yes, there is an agricultural census, and it tells us that, and it tells us the population. But I think it also, one of the big things is the rural development money that's available in Department of Agriculture. The other thing is farmers, and if they're in a farm area, how they can interact and develop and build a base because of the agricultural account. If you think about it, a John Deere dealership's not going to go into downtown Hartford, Connecticut. It's going to go into a rural area, and they're going to do the demographic study on that. So I think that's one way the census affects them. We're talking about road mileage and how much road miles and how we're going to develop those roads. All that is part of an agricultural base. Will have a lower census, but might have a greater amount of truck traffic. So they need to build all that together. So I think a lot of times it's a coordination between what the census is and what the agricultural census is. Again, two different numbers that are merged together to try to come up with those that way. We're also talking about the whole, I keep going back to food stamps because it slipped my mind what it's called now. But that whole area is under the Department of Agriculture. And so that they use those numbers quite a bit to figure out where they're going there. So again, how do we drill down into the demographics? How do we drill down into the breakup? Differs depending on what you're trying to do with those numbers. And knowing what the population of farmers is and looking at how much a farmer grows now. I mean, when we looked at the numbers at the turn of the 20th century, we had more farmers producing less food. We now have less farmers producing a lot more food. And so we need to look at those numbers and see how they're affected and how they're going to be used. I will tell you that when we're arguing for broadband in rural America, we're using that information. We're saying, look, these farmers are on a different level now. They're using GPS all the time. They're using their computers all the time. They need to be part of the broadband. They need to have good broadband so that they can remain competitive. So that's part of the argument that's being used. And part of that you're getting out of these numbers that will be coming out of the census.
There
So
are
going around the big corner there. But.
there are a lot of things that come from census numbers that I hadn't realized, or things that I haven't thought about for a long time when we were putting together this PSA. And we list off a couple things. We had to cut for time, a couple of others, but one of the things was funding for emergency services, and not just hospitals, but like fire apparatus, rural housing loan products, veterans service things in rural areas, and extension and agricultural research stations. What am I missing? What else?
I think you hit one of the major points on where are you going to put an agricultural research station? Do I need an agricultural research station here? How many agricultural research stations do I need? All those are in there using that count on the amount of agriculture there is. How are we being affected by our education? What type of education do we have in those areas? Is it still an agricultural area that has a strong FFA base? Or do I need even in a larger city, am I going to need at least a satellite farm station? Because all of a sudden I have either urban agriculture or I have aquaculture, let's say. We talk about the largest FFA, at least when I was commissioner, the largest FFA chapter was in the city of Bridgeport, and it was an aquaculture FFA chapter. You don't think of that, and you don't think about how diverse agriculture is and how widespread it is and what type of agriculture you have in an area. That comes more out of the agriculture census, but again, it melds in with the census.
So I'm gonna kill time for about 30 seconds because I know we have a lag, and just remind you that if you have questions about the census, questions about how those numbers are used doing the census or anything like that, or if you just want to ask a question of a board member, I see that I won't just put Phil on the spot. I did notice that our National Grange President, Betsy Huber, is here. I noticed that one of our other board members, Stephen Coy, has joined us. I noticed that Joan Smith, who's the president of the foundation board, has joined us. So if you have a question, I'll give you a few minutes to type that in. In the meantime, I guess, Phil, the only thing I'd ask you to do, besides if you have anything else that you want to add for the census, is tell us what has kind of been new and pesky and bothering your mind as a board member that you're hoping that, or give us a message about what we can do during this time as Grange members.
One of the big concerns that all of us have right now is, so much of the Grange is our friendship and our meeting and our social life, and all of a sudden we can't meet. How are we going to, I think we're all looking at how are we going to keep those meetings going? How are we going to keep that interrelationship going as part of our association? It's such a basic part of what we all believe in. We all, if you're an active Grange member, you love going to Grange meetings. Well, you can't go to those meetings. So that's a concern that I think all of us have. And how are we going to address that? When are we going to be able to get back together? Are people going to be willing to get back together afterwards? And when they look at this, that's a concern we all have, and we're looking at, and how are we going to meet? We've already decided that our next our next board meeting, because I'm also chairman of the board as well as vice president, our next board meeting is going to be a Zoom meeting. We're not going to meet face to face because it was scheduled for the beginning of May. So I think that, that's been an issue that we're all looking at. One of the issues that we'll constantly be looking at and planning and moving forward is our National Grange headquarters and what we're going to do and how we're going to improve that headquarters, how we're going to modernize that headquarters. We have a brand new conference room that we were all looking forward to seeing because we haven't been down there, but I guess we'll have to wait till our next board meeting. But I think as we move forward, how are we going to keep the organization strong and moving in the direction we want it to move in? That's going to continue to meet the basis we believe in and supporting and helping rural America.
You must have, by the way, covered the census perfectly, because we have no extra questions. Either that or it was a really boring topic, but we've had a consistent number of people live streaming. So the boring topic.
Either that or they were all so bored they just left. I know.
Well, I was just thinking that, it's so boring at home now that even the census discussion might be okay. But I'm just going to end with you with one thing, and that, you talked a little bit about that idea of keeping the fraternity and keeping that momentum going and things like that. In some of our other discussions, we've talked about, the need for anybody, not just Grange members, to have that human contact and togetherness after this is all over. And so I was just going to ask you to tell people who might be joining us who aren't members, that are looking forward to getting out of their house and getting to see other people, why some of those other people they should see are ones that are gathered in a Grange hall.
I think that we all believe as Grange members that we're there to serve our communities, and we're there to be there for our communities and work with our communities. I know a lot of, we all do different community service projects, and we all work together on different community service projects. I think what's so great about one of the things that's so great about our organization is that we don't tell the local Granges what their community service project should be. We allow them to work with their community to do the community service they need. We're also friendly, and we like to have good meals. So we have good dinners, and we get together and we meet on a friendly basis. If those who don't know, even though that I have been an elected official and I've been partisan in my life, the organization is not partisan, and we do not allow it to become partisan, to get to the partisan level. People ask, well, what do you mean by that? I said, when I was running my Grange, even though I was a past president of my Grange couldn't endorse me for the office because that would have been a partisan stand. Yet we do work on issues that affect our communities, such as broadband, such as working on telemedicine, or working on any other project in your state, and moving forward with those on a legislative basis. We have a strong legislative arm as well.
Thank you so much. I think you summed up, just another one of those things that we don't often tout or talk about that's really important, where we have that civil discussion. We talk about issues. We make sure that we're doing something that impacts our communities in positive ways, but, in that legislative realm. and yet we come together and eat together and enjoy each other's company, even if we're on different sides of something. So thanks for pointing that out. And thanks for being here to do this.
The arguments are sometimes the best part.
That's true.
But it's coming together after the arguments that make them all worthwhile.
So thank you for being here to talk about the census. I know that you volunteered to be on one of these, and so I'm not entirely sure if that was wise or not, but I do let anybody know who would like to volunteer to be on one of these. They can let me know. It was kind of painless, right, Phil?
It was.
Especially for a shy person like you.
Yeah, shy and quiet.
So thank you all for joining us. We've had a really consistent audience every time we've done this, and we really appreciate a lot of you who are joining us every day. We hope that you're getting something out of this experience, and if nothing else, that you're feeling like you do have that Grange family at your back in this hard time. Tomorrow we will join you at 3 o'clock Eastern. It will be a special presentation, special because I'm not 100% sure which guest I have coming tomorrow. Because that one is a little unknown, I should focus on the one that we do know, which is the really exciting one. Mark your calendars, clear your schedules. I know they're very packed right now. Your social dance card is probably full, but we're hoping that you'll join us for a date night in on Saturday, starting at 8:30 Eastern here. We're gonna have a virtual Grange talent show. So we're having some of our members who have amazing talents and skills going to bring them to you so that you can enjoy your Saturday evening with us. And so I hope that you will join us. And thank you again. Thanks, Phil.
You'll do anything to get me on Facebook, right?
I will absolutely do that. I expect you'll be watching from Maureen's account. Have a great day, guys. Thank you all so much. Stay safe, stay well, wash your hands.
And answer your census.
Yes, and do that too.